They say he lived beside a cemetery so vast it had its own weather. Fog that smelled of incense, rain that whispered names. Every night he lit a single bowl of rice before the graves, and by dawn, the food was gone. People said it was rats. He said it was gratitude. He had no name left to speak, only vows. The villagers called him the listener, for he spent his life beside those who no longer breathed. Sometimes, they swore they saw him bow to the earth and nod, as though answering a question no one else could hear. One winter, the rice remained untouched. The dead, it seemed, had stopped eating. The monk waited for 7 nights, sleepless and still, until the cold began to speak through the stone. He realized then that hunger was not the only thing that bound the living and the dead. Silence was, too. So on the 8th night, he broke the vow he had kept for 40 years. He knelt before the graves and whispered, "Tell me what you want." And in the pause that followed, the ground breathed back. Every day, another story rises from the quiet places the world forgot. Temples that breathe, graves that remember, and souls that refuse to rest. This is one of them. If this story finds you tonight, subscribe to Reimagined Orient. Each day, we unearth a legend whispered between life and death, tales of devotion, guilt, and the thin silence between prayer and curse. Leave a like to keep the lanterns burning, and tell us in the comments, from which city do you listen to the wind tonight? Now, let us return to the monk who taught silence how to speak. Chapter 1. The Field of Lanterns. The cemetery stretched from the edge of the forest to the foot of the mountain, a sea of uneven stones sinking into moss. The villagers called it the Field of Lanterns, because at night the monk lit candles among the graves until the hillside looked like a city built for spirits. Each flame swayed in the wind like a heartbeat remembering its rhythm. He had lived there for 40 years, though no one could remember when he first arrived. Some said he had been sent by the temple to watch over the restless. Others said he had buried his own name among them, a penance that turned into habit. Every dawn he gathered the bowls left empty by unseen mouths and refilled them before dusk. Rice, tea, sometimes fruit if the harvest was kind. He never asked for offerings in return. The villagers avoided the path after sunset. Yet children, curious and cruel in equal measure, sometimes crept close enough to hear him whispering to the earth. They swore they heard replies, low murmurs, half sigh, half breath. Their parents called it wind in the reeds. Still, no one stayed long enough to be sure. One evening the rain came sideways, sharp and cold. The monk sat beneath the small shrine roof and watched the candles fight the weather. The flames bent, but did not die. He took it as a sign that the dead were still listening. He closed his eyes and spoke the same words he had said every night. Eat, remember, rest. When morning came, the bowls were full. The rice had swollen with rain but not been touched. The monk frowned for the first time in years. He replaced the offerings, lit incense, and waited. The next night, and the next, the food remained. The candles burned shorter. The silence grew thick enough to taste. On the 7th night, the fog came crawling up from the valley, heavy and slow. It muffled the world until even the insects forgot their songs. The monk knelt among the stones and felt the damp crawl through his robes. He thought of the old sutra, "When the dead grow hungry, feed them light." He struck flint, lit a single candle, and placed it before the oldest grave, one whose name had long worn away. No wind, no sound, only the wick breathing. He bowed 3 times and spoke softly, "Have I offended you?" The candle flickered once. The fog shivered. The monk felt something brush his sleeve, colder than rain. Then came a sound he had never heard in 40 years, a small, deliberate scrape, like fingers moving through soil. He leaned closer. Beneath the ground, something shifted. The air thickened with the smell of wet stone and iron. The monk whispered, "You may speak." A voice answered, faint and dry as paper. "We have eaten enough rice. Now feed us memory." The monk's breath trembled, but his posture did not break. Whose memory? Yours. The flame flared blue, and every candle on the hillside caught it in an instant. The cemetery blazed with unnatural calm, the light steady as thought. The monk felt warmth crawl up his spine and into his skull, where old images began to move. A temple bell collapsing, a war he had never spoken of, a vow he had buried deeper than any grave. He pressed his palms together. Then let me remember. The earth responded with a sigh that shook the moss from the stones. The fog parted slightly, revealing rows of faces carved by shadow, each grave leaning toward him as though listening. The monk stayed until dawn, feeding the light with every breath he could spare. When the sun finally rose, the candles were ash. The rice was gone, and in its place, on every bowl, lay a single white petal, something the mountains did not grow. He gathered them carefully. They smelled like rain on fire. Chapter 2. Petals that remembered for him. By noon, the fog had climbed back into the mountain like a beast returning to its cave. The monk spread the white petals on the wooden floor of his hut, aligning them edge to edge, until they formed a pale river that flowed from the threshold to the altar. Each petal was flawless, veined with threads so fine the eye wanted to bow. When he leaned close, he saw ink where veins should have been, marks too delicate to be brushwork, too deliberate to be chance. At first the marks meant nothing, short curves, tiny hooks, strokes like eyelashes. Then he noticed they repeated. Here and there, a trio of lines arranged themselves as if remembering grammar. He fetched the old lamp and turned the wick until the flame thinned to a single bright needle. In that sting of light, the strokes rearranged, and a word rose into view, not written on any one petal, but across 5 of them. Ring. He closed his eyes and time unfastened. He was young again beneath a roof of cypress, a bell the size of a room hanging above him like a planet. War had flamed along the border. The temple had promised prayers to keep the soldiers safe. He remembered the abbot's hands, long and soft, tying a rope around the bell's tongue. You will ring at dawn and dusk, the abbot had said, until the world forgets how to break. The monk, then a novice, had nodded and believed the world ready to learn. The petals whispered when he opened his eyes. Their rustle sounded like pages turned by a careful storm. He gathered another handful and laid them beside the first river. The new veins shimmered and settled into a second word. Stop. Cold worked its way into his marrow. He remembered the dawn after the 5th siege, when smoke braided itself into the sky and did not come undone. He had rung the bell and heard no echo. The world had learned to break without making a sound. He had let the rope fall. He had stopped. The next cluster of petals formed a shape he could not read. He lifted them to the lamp, and they browned around the edges, reluctant to reveal more. He spread them on the altar and pressed his fingers to the floorboards as if listening through wood. A third word emerged, faint as breath on glass. Hush. The memory this time was not of war, but of one man, the soldier who had stumbled up the temple steps with a child in his arms. The soldier's mouth had been full of blood and apology. Only one prayer, he'd begged. Not for me. The child had not yet learned to speak. The monk had rung the bell anyway. It had made no sound. He had told the soldier to hush. The gods are tired. The monk's hands shook. He took the petals to the cemetery at dusk and placed one on each of the nearest graves. The hillside brightened, as if dawn had forgotten the proper direction. He felt watched, but not by eyes. Watched the way a river watches the stone it plans to move. I am ready, he said, knowing readiness is only a word people use when refusal would be a smaller sin. The graves answered without voices. The soil trembled in small, steady pulses. The heartbeat of a book that had remembered it was also a drum. A stone near his knee split along a seam that no mason had cut. From the fracture rose a thin ribbon of air, colder than the world around it. He leaned closer and understood. This was the dead exhaling what he had refused to breathe. The ribbon touched his brow and the cemetery turned into a hall of bells. Some were iron, some were bone, some were already broken. Each rang with a sound he knew how to name: regret, vow, mistake, mercy withheld. He staggered and caught himself with one hand in the moss. When the dizziness passed, the petals he had placed returned to his palm without his moving. They had changed again. No longer words, but a map, a lattice of veins that traced a path from his hut to the field, a southern wall. Then beyond the boundary stones into a strip of forest the villagers called Wolf's Throat. He had not walked that path in decades. It led to the only grave he had refused to tend. Night found him at the boundary. Tall grass hissed like 1,000 small refusals. He stepped over the stones, and the air dropped several degrees, clean and medicinal. The forest here was a different country. Trunks close as conspirators, branches knotted with old rope, wind speaking in a dialect that preferred endings. He followed the petal map until the ground rose under his feet, a low mound crowned with a single stake. The stake wore no name board. It wore his old prayer beads. He did not remember placing them. He did not remember the grave. The beads were cracked and pale, the cord frayed where a knot had been worried loose by weather. He touched the wood and felt teeth marks. His own. This was where he had tried to bite back a vow. Memory came like floodwater through a narrow gorge, sudden, bruising, capable of moving stone. He saw himself years ago walking into Wolf's Throat, behind 2 men with shovels and 1 man with a sword. He saw the prisoner they carried, not a soldier, not a thief, but a boy who had lit the bell rope on fire because he thought the smoke might carry prayers quicker. They had called it sacrilege. The abbot had called it lesson. The monk had called it necessary. They buried the boy without a name so the story would not multiply. He had left his beads to weigh the silence down. Then he had gone back to the temple and told the bell to forgive him. Bells do not forgive. Bells remember. He knelt until his bones spoke, then lay his forehead to the stake as if it were an altar. "I fed you rice," he whispered to the ground. "I should have fed you truth." The earth took the words the way a wound takes stitching, painfully, with purpose. The petals in his hand warmed and fused into a single white leaf. Writing formed along its spine in strokes thin as hair. Ring at midnight. He returned to the cemetery with the night leaning hard against his back. He lit every candle he owned and set them in a circle around the oldest grave. The bowl of rice he placed at the center heaved as if breathing. He lifted the mallet he had not touched in 40 years and found that his hands still knew the distance between air and sound. When the first stroke fell, the hill flinched. When the second fell, the fog rushed back, white and frantic, as if arriving late to a promise. He struck the bell a 3rd time, and somewhere beneath the graves, a door unlocked. Quietly, kindly, the way a house remembers the weight of a returning step. The dead did not rise. They spoke, all at once, with the voice of the boy he had buried without a name. "We were hungry for the memory you kept from us. Feed us the rest, and we will show you where your name went." Chapter 3. The sound beneath the earth. The bell's echo rolled through the valley like a tide made of breath. Dogs howled in the village below, birds scattered from trees that had forgotten flight. The monk waited for silence, but it did not come. The echo folded inward and began again, a steady rhythm pulsing through the ground. It was not sound anymore. It was heartbeat. He stood among the candles, the circle of light trembling around him, and the graves began to move. Not rise, breathe. Soil lifted and fell, slow and deliberate, as if the field itself were waking. The air thickened with the scent of cedar smoke and old rain. His robe clung to him with the damp of something living. Then the voice came again, clearer this time, spoken through every stone. Feed us the rest." The monk knelt. "I have nothing left but memory." "Then offer that." He reached for the bowl at the circle's center. The rice was gone, replaced by a thick gray ash that smelled faintly of tea and iron. He scooped a handful and pressed it to his lips. It was cold, bitter, but familiar. As it slid down his throat, his mind opened like an old door that hadn't been touched in decades. He saw himself kneeling before the abbot in the aftermath of the fire, the boy Key's body still smoldering outside. The abbot's words came back, sharp and calm. "If the temple is to stand, you must become its silence." The monk had bowed, swallowing protest like poison. In the days that followed, every sound felt like betrayal. Birds, bells, even breath. So he stopped speaking. He thought holiness was the absence of sound. He had been wrong. The wind shifted. The candles leaned inward. From the soil nearest him, small pale hands began to emerge. Not corpses, but shapes of light molded from ash and memory. They shimmered like smoke that had decided to stay. Each carried a petal in its palm, glowing faintly. The monk's breath hitched. "Who are you?" The hands trembled, and the air filled with whispers. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all weaving into one voice. "We are what you silenced." He bowed until his forehead touched the earth. "Then speak." The light around him wavered, then solidified into outlines. Children, elders, warriors, all carved from the color of moonlight. They surrounded him in silence, their faces blank as paper, waiting. He understood what they wanted, to remember themselves through him. The monk began to speak, slowly at first, then faster. He recited names he had not allowed himself to think for decades. The soldiers burned at the bell tower, the villagers starved during the siege, the boy with the flame in his eyes. For each name, one spirit dissolved, leaving behind only a drifting petal. The wind rose, candles flickered, his voice cracked but did not stop. The graveyard began to shine, brighter than moon or dawn. He felt his own heartbeat slow, replaced by the steady pulse beneath the earth. When the last name left his lips, the field fell utterly still. The air was thin and clear, the kind of silence that followed the first rain. He waited, trembling, unsure if he had freed them or invited something worse. Then, from the largest grave, the nameless one where it had begun, a figure rose. Not ghost, not man, but something caught between. It wore no face, only light shaped by memory. The monk felt no fear. The figure spoke in a voice that was both child and echo. "You have fed us truth. Now you must feed yourself." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "The living must eat too." The figure stepped forward and pressed its hand to his chest. A warmth spread through him, unbearable, cleansing. He gasped as images cascaded behind his eyes. The boy smiling before the fire, the abbot's face softening with regret, the temple roof collapsing under its own prayers. When the figure withdrew, his chest glowed faintly through the fabric, a small circle of light pulsing like an open eye. He touched it, and the warmth did not fade. The figure bowed. "When you wake, the world will remember what you were." And then the light collapsed inward, flowing back into the earth. The candles went out. Darkness filled the valley again, but it was not the same darkness. It breathed differently, calm, full, alive. The monk fell forward, exhausted, his cheek pressed to the soil that now felt warm as flesh. Somewhere beneath him, he thought he heard laughter, not cruel, not kind, simply free. Then he slept, and the graves kept breathing without him. Chapter 4. When the living began to listen, he woke with the taste of ash and dawn on his tongue. The air was no longer cold. It carried the smell of rain turned sweet. The candles had melted into small white pools, and in the distance the first crows were calling to one another across the valley. For a long time he thought the night's vision had been a dream. Then he noticed the graves. Every stone bore markings that had not been there before, not carved by human hands, but written by something patient and steady. The same delicate strokes that had once crossed the petals. He rose slowly, joints creaking, and ran his fingers across a nearby slab. The words were warm. "We remember." He stepped to the next. Ring again. Another. Let them hear. Beyond the wall, the village was already awake. He heard no hammering, no chatter, only a long hush that felt like listening. He gathered his robe around him and began to walk down the hill, each step stirring a low hum from the ground. The hum followed him like an obedient thought. At the village gate, he stopped. Children stood in the road, barefoot, eyes wide as lanterns. One girl pointed toward the monastery ruins on the far ridge. "Master," she said, "the bell is ringing, but no one's there." He turned. The sound reached him then, a note pure enough to unspool memory. It wasn't loud. It was alive. It moved through the valley like breath, curling around the huts, slipping under doors. He felt it in his ribs, the way a name feels when finally spoken aloud. The villagers came out of their houses, faces tilted upward. Some wept without knowing why. Old men clasped their hands as if remembering prayers they hadn't dared repeat in decades. The monk stood among them and realized the note was not coming from the old tower at all. It came from beneath their feet. He looked down. Beneath the thin crust of dirt, faint lines of light traced paths between every home, joining at the base of the hill, leading back to the cemetery. The ground itself was ringing. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. "You can stop now," he whispered. The bell note softened but did not end. Instead it changed shape, became rhythm, became breath. A voice, many voices, woven together until they formed words. "We are not hungry anymore." Tears cut clean lines through the dust on his face. "Then I will rest." The wind picked up, scattering petals from nowhere. They whirled through the air, white and slow, settling on roofs, in hair, in the cracks of old wood. Wherever they landed, the people fell silent again. They weren't afraid. They were listening. A child's voice rose behind him. "Master, are the dead happy now?" He smiled faintly. "No, they are remembered. That is better." The wind quieted. The light beneath the soil faded, but the warmth remained. He felt it pass through him into the ground, joining whatever lived there now. For the first time in a lifetime, he was certain of nothing, and in that uncertainty, he found peace. When night returned, the villagers lit candles and placed them on their windowsills. They did not pray. They simply waited for the bell, and when it rang, soft and even, the sound carried through every door and every heart, a reminder not of death, but of presence. The monk returned to his hut above the graves. He set one last bowl of rice on the threshold and whispered, "For the ones still learning to speak." The bowl stayed full, but the air around it shimmered like water catching moonlight. Chapter 5. The Last Offering. Weeks passed before anyone noticed he had not come down from the hill. The villagers thought he was meditating again, keeping company with the silence he had taught them to respect. When the children went to leave bowls of rice at his door, they found the hut empty. The mat where he had slept was undisturbed, and on the table rested his robe neatly folded beside the old mallet. The air in the hut was warm, faintly fragrant with incense, though no stick burned. In the center of the floor, where the altar had once stood, a thin ring of white petals circled an unlit candle. When the smallest child leaned close to touch the wax, the flame bloomed of its own accord, steady, without smoke. It did not burn the wick. It breathed. That night the villagers climbed the path to the cemetery carrying lanterns, not from fear but from longing. The graves no longer stirred, yet the soil looked soft, tended. Every bowl set before the stones filled itself with rice as pale as moonlight. They did not speak of miracles, they simply bowed. When the wind came down from the mountain, it carried the faint sound of a bell. By the new season, the valley had changed. The fields grew green where ash had once lain. Birds returned to the rafters, and the river learned its song again. People stopped calling the hill a graveyard and began to call it the place that listens. Each year, on the night of the first rain, they placed candles along the paths. No one asked why the flames never went out in the wind. They told the children a simple version of the story. A monk had fed the dead until they learned to speak, and when they no longer needed his voice, he became the echo that answered theirs. The older ones said he still walked among the graves when fog descended, carrying a bowl in one hand and a petal in the other. The very old said the bell itself was his heart, still ringing because the world was not yet finished learning, and so the valley slept without fear. The living remembered, the dead listened, and the wind that passed through the cypress carried both prayer and laughter together. If you stood there at dusk, you could still hear him. Just once, faint but certain. Eat, remember, rest, closing. The monk who fed the dead until they spoke back. They say a prayer never truly ends. It only changes mouths. In the valley where the bell still breathes, the living speak softer now, afraid to drown out the voices they once ignored. Every candle lit upon that hill is a promise. That memory is the only food the dead will ever need. Some nights, the mist returns, curling around the graves like the sleeve of a patient god. And if you listen closely, you might hear him, not as words but as warmth, the quiet hum that lingers between heartbeats. He does not ask for offerings anymore. He is the offering. So when you hear the wind tonight, let it ring through you instead of past you. That's how the monk taught the world to pray, not by silence but by remembering out loud.